Hello everyone, this is Mr. Laubach. I hope you're doing well. In this lecture, we are going to focus on the importance of different types of technology used during the Civil War. We're going to talk about bullets, guns, submarines, hot air balloons, the telegraph, and the railroad in the context of the war. The Civil War is often referred to as the first modern war since it began after the American Industrial Revolution began. That is important. Traditional battle tactics combined with more modern weapons made for a war like never seen before in regards to bloodshed, death, and suffering. The Civil War was the deadliest in U.S. history by far. Well over 600,000 people were killed, and many more were injured or permanently maimed. Now, 600,000 people being killed would be the equivalent of 6 million people being killed with the current American population, just to give you an idea. The war famously pitted brother against brother, friend against friend, as the United States was literally divided pretty much in half. Countless families had members fighting on both sides of the war. For the first time in U.S. history, war was the focus of American industry. Now, we would see this later on when the U.S. was involved and getting ready to get involved in World War I and World War II. As an example of this focus, companies that produced pitchforks before the war started to produce swords and bayonets during the war. Inventors and military men devised new types of weapons. There ended up being literally thousands of patents that were filed on new inventions for the war. Another byproduct of the war-focused industry was that many people got rich because of the Civil War. One of the biggest improvements in technology that resulted in many more deaths was a new bullet called the mini ball. This was a lead bullet that was invented in France by a dude with the last name Mini, hence the name. This mini ball or mini bullet was more accurate and had better range than previous musket bullets. The rivets in the mini ball and the rifling in the gun was able to spin the projectile, making it more fatal and had an accuracy as far as 600 yards. More traditional musket balls would not spin and would fly sort of like a knuckleball, being very inaccurate and unpredictable, and could not be effective at long distances. The mini ball was used by both the North and the South. Even though it was just a small piece of lead, it was incredibly destructive and had quite an impact on the Civil War. During the war, early machine guns were developed, including what was known as a repeating rifle. The Union took most advantage of this weapon, and it gave them a distinct leg up towards the end of the war. The invention by Richard Jordan Gatling in 1862, called the Gatling gun, as you can see pictured here, would fire automatically using a spinning motion and would provide a sustained firing burst. During the American Civil War, 12 of the guns were purchased personally by Union commanders and used in the trenches during the siege of Petersburg, Virginia. The Confederacy did not have access to the Gatling gun. Even the relatively few Gatling guns used by the U.S. Army were privately purchased by wealthy Union officers and pretty primitive and didn't have too much of a drastic impact on the overall war. They would be seen later as being a more significant weapon during the Spanish-American War. Hot air balloons were used during the Civil War as well. They were not used as weapons as much as they were used for reconnaissance to get a better picture of where opposing troops were, their movements, their numbers, and locations. Hot air balloons were basically used as the precursor to the spy plane. As you can imagine, hot air balloons had their limitations, but they did help. The Civil War introduced submarines into naval warfare. These vessels were very primitive and certainly not like the ones that we are used to seeing nowadays or even in World War I and World War II. The first submarine to sink an enemy ship was a Confederate submarine, A.L. Hunley, which sank a Union ship in February of 1864. The Union, on the other hand, mostly used submarines to remove underwater obstructions. The most famous Union submarine was the USS Alligator. Pretty cool name for a vessel. Another great weapon of war, especially for the Union, was railroads. Early on, Lincoln was able to federalize the North's railroads, and they came under control of the government. Railroads sped up troop and supply deployment. The North had quite an advantage here. The North had access to 24,000 miles of railroad compared to the South's 9,000 miles. Throughout the war, the North was able to lay another 4,000 miles of railroad. The South also had less uniform railroads and different size gauges or rails, so they were unable to complete many trips using the same railroad cars and would oftentimes have to load from one car to another because of the differing size railroad gauge. The logistics from being able to dominate railroads proved to be crucial in the Union victory. Now, along with railroads, the North had quite an advantage with telegraphs. Telegraphs, as you might remember, were invented in 1844 and were a way in which information could be instantaneously transmitted over large distances. The Union had access to 50,000 miles of telegraph line. Telegraphs allowed immediate contact between the military and its leaders. During the war, Lincoln basically became addicted to the telegraph. He would spend hours and hours in the telegraph room listening and reading records of earlier messages. Lincoln would directly command his generals in real time in the field by giving them orders via telegraph. On the other side, the South simply did not have access to the telegraph like the North did. The South had slower, more traditional modes of communication, which you could see would be quite a disadvantage in a war. Future steel tycoon Andrew Carnegie was in charge of the U.S. military telegraph throughout the course of the Civil War. We'll learn more about him when we get to the Gilded Age. So wrapping up here, innovations in technology dramatically impacted the Civil War. It made the war more deadly and catastrophic and led to mind-blowing numbers of casualties and deaths. The new technology of the war benefited the North more, and they were more able to access and produce it. The technological advancements of the American Civil War changed warfare forever.